Climate scientists rarely speak publicly about their personal views, but in the wake of some record-breaking heat waves and weather events in Australia, some of the specialists who make predictions about our climate reveal they're anxious about the future. With global temperatures rising faster than anticipated, some scientists are making plans for themselves and their families. For this report, Lateline sought a range of opinions from experts at top climate change research units within the country's major universities. What emerged from those who responded was a consistency of concern. We'll hear shortly from our studio guests, Matthew Warren from the Australian Energy Council and adaptation specialist Professor John Barnett. But first, a few of those personal stories reported by Kerry Brewster.
I think this one's one of my favourite.
4 climate scientists at different stages in their lives and careers reveal the burden of knowing what predicted climate changes will bring.
I think for years I was really living in 2 different worlds. I was the scientist at work who was just objectively looking at numbers, and then over years starting to be more and more worried about my own life, but I separated it completely from my private life. I think that was a little bit of a self-protection. That doesn't really work that well anymore. In the past few years, I carry this knowledge with me wherever I am.
Oh, that looks beautiful, Caitlin.
But otherwise,
that looks amazing. Look at this.
My name is Katrien Meisner. I'm the director of the Climate Change Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. I've been working in this field for the last 20 years and I've been mapping lots of concerning trends in that time.
Many people do not really understand how big a threat climate change is to humanity. The changes that we see right now are much faster than anything we have seen in the climate history. And that concerns me because it means that ecosystems might not be able to adapt. It's going to be dramatic. It's going to be very dramatic.
I think one day in the last heat wave, I measured 45 degrees outside in the shade on our front patio, and it was 39 on the inside. I was sleeping with wet towels on my legs to keep cool. So I'm Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick, and I'm a research fellow at the University of New South Wales. And what I look at is heat waves. So how they've changed, why they've changed, what their changes will be in the future, how we measure them, and the role of climate change behind heat waves. I had conversations with my husband as these heat waves were occurring in the summer, going, are we doing the right thing? Is it right to bring kids into this world? With me knowing how bad it's going to be. There is so much wrong with climate change and there's so many impacts that we're already locked into that I can't change, that no one can really change. It's going to be bad. And it's almost, why would you inflict that on someone?
Okay, so that's where it's going to go. My name is Justin Urgis. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Melbourne, just looking at urban microclimate as it is now and looking at how we can improve it into the future. We need to be able to plan our cities better, need to be able to design them better, keeping in mind what's coming, keeping in mind these temperatures that are getting into the 50s in Melbourne. And often I can't believe that I'm saying that, but the computer models or the research is telling us this is what's coming. Yeah, it's tragic. Whenever I talk to my wife about heat waves, she gets scared of them. And unfortunately, I can't really give her any good news. Okay, I've been married for about 5 years. Yes, we want children, but we're quite concerned about it, even scared of it. Our parents both want us to have children, and there's a lot of joy that comes with having children. But at the same time, knowing what's coming with climate change, we've actually just been putting it off.
You can say you don't believe in gravity, but the apple's still going to hit you on the head. You can say you don't believe in climate change, but it's not going to stop it getting hotter. I think Australia is the most vulnerable, developed country in the world to climate change. My name's Professor David Griggs. I work at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University. My background is as a climate scientist and atmospheric physicist. In the past, I've been head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Science Working Group Secretariat. I've been director of the Hadley Centre for Climate Change, which is the UK Government Research Centre into Climate Change. And I've been the vice chair of the World Climate Research Programme. I think we're heading to a future with a considerably greater warming than 2 degrees. And when the world doesn't do something about it, that brings a whole range of emotions into play. I mean, depression is clearly something. You know, you get days when you are down because you just, what you know and what you can see coming is not good. For people living in Australia, it means that a lot of people will suffer and a lot of people will die. The problem is nobody's death certificate will say this person died of climate change. They will say they died of heat stress or cardiac arrest or they died in a bushfire.
Climate scientists are under a lot of scrutiny. We get ridiculed a lot by certain people for being alarmists, by going too much into detail, where in actual fact we're actually probably reservists and are very conservative in our estimates and make sure we're so sure of the numbers before we actually get them out there. I don't like to scare people, but the future's not looking very good.
Well, I'm fortunate in that I live in Melbourne at the moment, and Melbourne is one of the more climate-adapted cities in Australia. But if I was living in Darwin or Brisbane, I would be seriously thinking about moving. One of the important things about climate change, when you think of it in the context of sustainable development.
Among climate scientists, the conversation is turning to their personal plans.
We'll talk about where we're planning to retire to or where we're planning to move to and how we're planning to, safeguard our families in the future. And the consensus seems to be Tasmania. Tassie, because it's the furthest south, it's the coolest.
We have thrown up the idea and potentially if the opportunities came up moving to somewhere like Canberra. So it's a city, it's got good infrastructure, got good employment opportunities. Yes, it gets warm there and yes, it's a dry climate, but the temperature doesn't get as hot as Sydney. Their nighttime temperatures are a lot cooler. And you can cope with extreme heat much better if you've got cooler nighttime temperatures to sleep.
For me and my wife anyway, may be forced to move further south, and I'm sure that there's a lot of other people that are probably thinking the same thing. My grandpa decided to move down to the coolest part of Australia. He's living on a boat south of Hobart and he's trying to drag me down to Tasmania. He's saying, oh, the University of Tasmania is down here, should come down here. And I've often said to him that I think about it. My wife, she's a lot more keen to do it.
I find it really hard to decide on one particular region, saying this one is going to be safe and we're just going to lock this one in. I don't think there will be any safe places. The impacts are going to be big. So my approach is to be as mobile, as flexible as possible, to be able to adapt to whatever is going to happen. My children are bilingual and we're working on a third language. Both children have 3 passports and they actually have the freedom to be able to study and work either in the European Union or in Canada or in Australia.
After scoping New Zealand and Tasmania, Professor Griggs has settled on his native England as a climate change retreat.
London's over here on the right-hand side, so we're down here in the southwest with Devon and Cornwall. So this is the house, just a traditional old English farmhouse built around about 1800. That's my vegetable patch, so that's where I can grow my own food. I've certainly taken a look at this and looked at the climate projections and said, yeah, that's going to be good for the next sort of 100 years or so. When some new fact comes in that makes me fearful, I think, well, at least I've done what I can to protect my family. I can't protect them from changes in the global economy. I can't protect them from mass migrations. I can't protect them from some of the impacts that they're going to do no matter where I move to and no matter where I buy my house. But I can do what I can.
Professor John Barnett is a political geographer at the University of Melbourne's Department of Resource Management and Geography. His research focuses on the impacts of climate change on social systems and ways to adapt. He's a lead author of a recent assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Matthew Warren is the CEO of the Australian Energy Council. They both joined me here in the studio earlier from Melbourne. Gentlemen, welcome.
Evening, Emma.
Good evening.
First, let me begin with your reaction to what we've just seen. John Barnett.
You have to feel for climate scientists who spend their time investigating the impacts of climate change. It must be a depressing occupation and hard to find the hope in that story. It's even perhaps more surprising that most of what they were talking about is heat stress. In fact, there's going to be a range of other impacts on natural ecosystems, on our coastline, on our alpine areas and our water systems, increasing extreme events and so on. So in some ways, they're only focusing on a small part of the full magnitude of impacts that we'll be experiencing in Australia.
Matthew Warren, a lot of our viewers will be shouting alarmists at the TV.
Yeah, look, the view of industry on this has been pretty clear for a while. We're not interested in whether judging on scientists being right and wrong. This is a risk issue, and what scientists keep telling us and have been telling us for the past 2 decades is that this is serious and the risk is material, and it's been translated through higher insurance premiums and through the cost of borrowing for assets into the future. So it's not about believing in climate science anymore, it's about managing this risk, and the risk is material.
John Barnett, you're an adaptation specialist. What do you see as the most urgent change we need to be making to buttress our cities from the worst of global warming?
I think we need to really embrace the idea that the climate is changing. I think we're stumbling forward into the future as if the environment in which we're living is going to remain the same forever, and that's clearly not the case. Secondly, I think we need to anticipate the kinds of environmental and social impacts that will arise in response to those changes, begin to plan for them now. We know from our experience around the world that early planning and long-term strategic planning for changing markets, changing environmental conditions, changing living conditions creates the most efficient, effective and orderly way of adapting to environmental change. Flooding events, drought events, bushfire events around the outsides of our cities, it raises questions about where people are living at the moment, whether they're living in floodplain areas, low-lying coastal areas, areas exposed to bushfire, for example.
Are you saying, pardon the interruption, are you saying people really do quite genuinely need to reconsider where they're living?
I think not immediately, but in the longer term, we are going to have to face some decisions about where people are living because the environments in which they're living are changing.
When you say longer term, what do you mean?
I think that's a really difficult question in climate science. It's very hard to anticipate when impacts will unfold, but we can be certain that they will, and we can make measures to respond in a timely manner as we observe our environment changing, as opposed to leaving it too late and having those changes occur catastrophically.
Matthew Warren, given where you come in this conversation, I want to gauge your opinion on something the Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel, said in his press club address last week. Wind and large-scale solar, even without subsidies, he said, are dominating investor interest. Investors prefer wind and solar because they're now cheaper to build than traditional generation such as hydro and coal.
It's true. They're also shorter life assets. We're seeing dynamic change in energy markets. We're seeing new technologies arriving. So one of the risks around building a coal-fired generator is simply it has to get a 50-year payback, and it's very hard to see what the energy market will look like in 50 years. A wind farm is more like 15 to 20 years. That's a lot safer investment. The challenge with wind and solar, of course, is their intermittency. So we need to work out ways in which we manage and balance that so we get the low emissions, lower cost electrons, but we back that up and we balance it with other technologies so we have enough electrons when we need them.
Matthew, what's your assessment of the way the government is helping our population address this issue and adapt to change?
Look, I think it's pretty clear there's a confusion from the public. I mean, I think this is a complex issue, and like energy market reform, the public don't really want to have to delve into the complex detail. They want governments to lead. They want governments to get advice from scientific experts, from industry leaders, from environment groups, and say, what do we do? And take that advice and act on it. And that's really their role. And we seem to sort of find this in an ideological context now where you believe in something or you don't believe in it, and we're way past that point. So we're just desperate for government to retreat back to its role as a leader and coordinator, taking the advice from the various key stakeholders, and so we can act on it. We can deliver solutions, and other parts of the economy can and will deliver solutions, but we've got to get the right signal. So in the case of energy, there is a shadow price on carbon in the world now. If you want to borrow money to build a coal-fired generator, banks will factor in the carbon risk, and we need governments to somehow monetise that because we can't move forwards until they do.
So what was your view, Matthew, on the government's seeming openness to the idea of subsidising new coal-fired power stations?
We are technology neutral. We don't have a view about using any technology ahead of any other. Coal has an advantage, it's cheap. Its big disadvantage is it has very high emissions. Renewables have the opposite. They are becoming cheaper to build new. They have zero emissions, but they don't have the same reliability factor that coal does. Now, we don't care what the grid of the 21st century looks like, providing it's the lowest cost, it's reliable, and it brings emissions down to the levels that's required. We will find, and we expect to find, the market discovers really exotic solutions to that. It may involve batteries, it may involve demand management, and a whole suite of technologies bundled together in a way that no one thought of, and that's okay. It's that we get the job done and that the public worry about something else, because this is past the point where we're winning at this. We need to get back to delivering solutions led by government, implemented by business.
John Barnett, I want to pick up on something you've written before about being exercised about the inequality that climate change will bring. And I want you to explain what you mean by that.
We understand that whenever there's large-scale structural changes in the economy, some people profit and some people fall out the back of markets. And typically, in a society that's well organised, we provide restructuring or assistance to regenerate the economies of people who fall behind. We've been through massive transition we've seen around the world, for example, in coal-fired power areas in the United Kingdom. This is also going to be forced by climate change. We're seeing changes, significant changes in the water market in inland Australia. We're seeing some irrigating communities do very well out of that. We're seeing some irrigation communities fall behind. The Wentworth Group released a report yesterday saying exactly that around Moree and Deniliquin, those communities are not doing well out of the water market. People are exiting the community, economic production is going down. We understand, we've seen this in electricity markets. We may see these changes occur around disasters and insurance, that increasingly people living in at-risk areas will no longer be able to get private insurance. They may be experiencing significant impacts due to climate change. So climate change is going to force economic changes, and it's very important that we anticipate those and begin to think about reconstructing economies, new forms of innovation, new forms of economic development, particularly in rural areas where I think we're already seeing a dual-speed economy, and climate change will increase that inequality between rural and urban areas.
Are you advising government on this, John?
No, I think that most of the work that we've seen on climate change adaptation has been focused much more on the impacts on the natural environment. We haven't thought very much about the social impacts. I think governments have not got a particularly long-term vision there. I think it's also important to recognise that there's a lot of risk for governments beginning to have honest conversations about living differently in the Australian environment, but that's what's required to make long-term and orderly strategic plans for us to be still a prosperous and fair society into the future.
Matthew Warren, given the industry accepts the science and therefore the need to bring down emissions, what responsibility do you feel towards staff about transitioning them away from jobs, say, in the coal-fired power generation sector that may certainly sometime soon no longer exist?
It depends on where we're located. Certainly in some of the deals done in Victoria dealing with the Hazelwood employees, there's been a program to transfer some employees to other generators and power stations in that region. In places like Port Augusta, where the Northern Power Station closed last year, the social dislocation in a community like that is enormous, and it's challenging just to find any other alternative employment opportunities for those workers. It's clearly part of the social contract in the 21st century. Businesses have responsibility to their workers and to the communities they work in, and we're no different to anyone else. And part of the responsibility of government is signalling these changes are coming so that we can all make plans as to how we adapt and adjust. One of the things with the revolution in renewables is they have lower long-term employment levels than thermal generators because they don't have fuel. They basically work on automatic pilot most of the time. They have a bit of maintenance, but the labour levels in those new industries are lower than the current ones. It makes them cheaper, it makes them safer. So it's a great problem to have, and we have to work out how we adapt the economy in our sector and others to cope with these changing technologies.
John Barnett, former Australian of the Year Tim Flannery and Chief Counsellor of the Climate Council, he I'm wondering whether you're dismayed by some of the predictions he made 10 or so years ago. Arctic ice could melt away completely by 2015. Obviously, that didn't happen. Sydney, Adelaide and Brisbane could all run out of water by now. Has that set the cause of adaptation back somewhat, given people have seen those predictions for what they have turned out to be and thought, perhaps this is a bit alarmist and we don't need to worry about this for 100, 200 or more years?
I think this is the time question again. I think it's really important that we distinguish the timing of the question about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We talk about the critical decade, and I think that's correct, which requires urgent change. I think the adaptation task is perhaps not so urgent, and in some ways that's a very good thing, because I think it's going to be actually much more difficult than adjustments in the electricity sector for all that we've been talking about, adapting the energy sector to the realities of climate change. We have multiple sectors across the country that we're going to need to adapt to. Where we build things, how we get our water, how we insure against risk, how we manage our tourism, our climate-dependent tourism in the barrier reef or snow areas. These are going to be really massive transitions, and they're going to take a long time to work through. It's important that we start now, but we don't rush. We know also from a range of academic research that scaring people about climate change doesn't really empower them and doesn't really produce productive responses. What we know from the energy sector that Matthew's been talking about is innovation, excitement, creating opportunities and dynamism is what catalyses change, and we need to bring that kind of idea about climate change and the need to change as being opportunities for renewable, for regeneration, for innovation and investment across a range of sectors and places in the Australian economy. That's what's really going to drive change, rather than scaring people into thinking that the world is coming to an end.
Perhaps the first thing we need to adapt is political terms, so governments have a longer horizon in considering these issues and making plans for the future. Gentlemen, we're out of time. Matthew, Warren, John Barnett, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Emma.
And that's all we have time for tonight. You can find all of Lateline's stories and interviews, as always, on our website. I'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.